while church bells rang in the villages along shore. The world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. "Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass." Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who had came to Gatsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed, "This schedule in effect, July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. From East Egg, then, came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches and a man named Bunsen, whom I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackbuck, who had always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whosoever came near. And the Ismays and the Christies, or rather, Hubert Auerbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter afternoon for no good reason at all. Clarence Endive was from East Egg, as I remember. He came only once in white knickerbockers and had a fight with a bum named Eddie in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Cheadles and the O.R.B. Schraders and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia and the Fish Guards and the Ripley Snells. Snell was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat's automobile ran over his right hand. The Danceys came too, and S.B. Whitebait, who was well over 60, and Maurice A. Flink, and the Hammerheads, and Beluga the tobacco importer, and Beluga's girls. From West Egg came the Poles, and the Mulreadys, and Cecil Roebuck, and Cecil Shawn, and Gullick the state senator, and Newton Orchid, who controlled films par excellence, and Exhaust, and Clyde Cohen, and Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all connected with the movies in one way or another, and the Catlips and the Bembergs, and G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. Da Fontano, the promoter, came there, and Ed Legros, and James B. Rodgut Ferret, and the De Jongs, and Ernest Lilly. They came to gamble. And when Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was cleaned out, and associated traction would have to fluctuate profitably next day. A man named Klipspringer was there so often that he became known as the Boarder. I doubt if he had any other home. Of theatrical people, there were Gus Ways, and Horace O'Donovan, and Lester Meyer, and George Duckweed, and Francis Bull. Also from New York were the Cromes, and the Packisons, and the Denekers, and Russell Betty, and the Corrigans, and the Kellers, and the Dewars, and the Scullys, and S.W. Belcher, and the Smirks, and the Young Quinns, divorced now, and Henry L. Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClenahan arrived always with 4 girls. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical, one with another, that it inevitably seemed they had been there before. I have forgotten their names. Jacqueline, I think, or else Consuela, or Gloria, or Judy, or June. ever knew it, I have forgotten. All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock one morning, late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its three-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation, made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car, with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American. That comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work in youth, and even more, with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" passed us in a hearse, heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled toward us in a haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen, without any particular wonder. Roaring noon, in a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom, talking to another man. "Mr. Carraway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfsheim." A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair, which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. "So I took one look at him," said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. "And what do you think I did?" "What?" I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Gatsby and I said, "All right, Gatsby, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth." He shut it then and there. Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into a sonambulatory abstraction. "Eyeballs," asked the head waiter. "This is a nice restaurant here," said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling, "but I like across the street better." "Yes, eyeballs," agreed Gatsby, and then to Mr. Wolfsheim, "It's too hot over there." "Hot and small, yes," said Mr. Wolfsheim, "but full of memories." "What place is that?" I asked. "The old Metropole." "The old Metropole," brooded Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily. "Filled with faces dead and gone, filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. It was When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. "I have enjoyed my lunch," he said, "and I'm going to run off from you two young men before I outstay my welcome." "Don't hurry, Meyer," said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised his hand in a sort of benediction. "You're very polite, but I belong to another generation," he announced solemnly. "You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your—" He supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. "As for me, I am 50 years old, and I won't impose myself on you any longer." As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wondered if I had said anything to offend him. "He becomes very sentimental sometimes," explained Gatsby. "This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York, a denizen of Broadway." "Who is he anyhow? An actor?" "No." "A dentist?" "Meyer Wolfsheim?" "No, he's a gambler." Gatsby hesitated, then added coolly, "He's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. "Fixed the World Series," I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened. The end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people, with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. "How did he happen to do that?" I asked after a minute. "He just saw the opportunity. Why isn't he in jail?" "They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man." I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. "Come along with me for a minute," I said. "I've got to say hello to someone." When he saw us, Tom jumped up and took half a dozen steps in our direction. "Where have you been?" he demanded eagerly. "Daisy's furious because you haven't called up." "This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan." They shook hands briefly, and a strained, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face. "How have you been, anyhow?" demanded Tom of me. "How do you happen to come up this far to eat?" "I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby." I turned towards Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. "One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel. "I was walking along from one place to another, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had on a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind, and whenever this happened, the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses because it seemed romantic to me. I've remembered the incident ever since. His name was Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realize it was the same man. That was 1917. By the next year, I had a few beaux myself, and I began to play in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd, when she went with anyone at all. Wild rumors were circulating about her, how her mother had found her. Packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. After that, she didn't play around with the soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She had a debut after the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Mulbach Hotel, and the day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed, as lovely as the June night, in her flowered dress, and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Sauterne in one hand and a letter in the other. "Congratulate me," she muttered. "Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it." "What's the matter, Daisy?" I was scared, I can tell you. I'd never seen a girl like that before. "Here, dears." She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. "Take 'em downstairs and give 'em back to whoever they belong to. Tell 'em all Daisy's changed her mind. Say, Daisy's changed her mind." She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up in a wet ball, and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress, and half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck and the incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom Buchanan without so much as a shiver and started off on a 3-month trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If he left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way, came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a vast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild, but she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation, perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue and, moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own so that everybody else is so blind that they don't see or care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for amour at all, and yet there's something in that voice of hers. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in West Egg? After you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me up and said, "What Gatsby?" And when I described him, I was half asleep. She said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. When Jordan Baker had finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in a Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of children, already gathered like crickets on the grass, rose through the hot twilight. I'm the Sheik of Araby. Your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep. It was a strange coincidence, I said, but it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Then it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over. The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths, so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? He's afraid. He's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's regular tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained, and your house is right next door. Oh. I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, went on Jordan, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years, just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard-limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to that brings us to the end of Chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby. We hope that you've enjoyed this reading, and we hope that you'll join us as we read Chapter 5 in future videos. In case you're not already aware,